Are mass shootings preventable? Absolutely they are. This is an objective discussion, not a political discussion. If you want to learn more, then make sure you keep watching. The question posed earlier was, are mass shootings preventable? Yes, absolutely there are. So my name is Bridget. I'm a family nurse practitioner. I have a master's degree in nursing education. I'm also a registered nurse. How do we practice medicine? By looking at the evidence, by looking at research studies and saying, oh, research shows that this medication does not work for this. Research shows that this intervention helps people have better outcomes. For example, looking at research to see if people should take aspirin or not. They do studies, and they see which people should do or which screening should be done. Why are we not doing the same approach for these mass shootings? Well, there actually is research in regards to mass shooting. It's just that politicians are not looking at the research and are not doing anything about it. This is a hot topic, and this incites a lot of emotions in people. I urge you to look at this from an objective point of view. What does objective mean? It means setting aside political affiliations. It means setting aside feelings and looking at objective data to see what works and what is not working, and what we have now is not working. If you are unable to look at this with an open mind, if you are unable to look at the data objectively, then skip this video, because you are not going to be. When we are emotionally charged with something, our minds become clouded and we do not think with reason. Our frontal lobe actually disengages, which means we are no longer thinking logically. I'm going to start with the most controversial topic in regards to how mass shootings can be preventable. This video is based on a research study that was conducted by Adam Lankford, Krista Adkins, and Eric Madfis. All have studied criminology. All have studied criminology and criminal justice and have published books on this and have researched this extensively. And these are the individuals that we should be asking about what can be done to prevent these tragedies. Number one, what we know is that mass shooters, 80% of the time, acquire their firearms legally. This is a hot topic because of the Second Amendment, and people have this almost visceral reaction, don't take my guns away, right? Well, 80% of public mass shooters in this study were able to acquire all of their firearms for their attack legally. I'm going to refer you to the 2007 Virginia Tech shooting. The firearms were legally purchased from a gun store and a pawnbroker. Although his having been court-ordered to receive mental health treatment could have prohibited the purchase, it did not, and he purchased it legally. In 2009, the Bingham shootings, those were legally purchased from a gun store. 2009 Fort Hood Army Base shooting, those firearms were legally purchased from a gun store. 2012 Aurora Movie Theater shooting, those firearms were legally purchased from a gun store. 2013 Washington, D.C. Navy Yard shooting, legally purchased a shotgun from a gun store after being prohibited from purchasing an assault rifle because he was an out-of-state resident. 2015 Charleston Church shooting, firearms were legally purchased from a gun store, although his drug possession charge could have prohibited the purchase. 2015 UCC shooting, firearms legally purchased through a federally licensed firearms dealer. 2015 San Bernardino attack, firearms legally purchased at gun stores by the male offender and his neighbor. 2016, and this one is close to my heart because I live in Orlando, Florida. 2016 Orlando nightclub shooting, the Pulse shooting. Firearms were legally purchased at gun store. 2017 Las Vegas shooting, legally purchased at gun store and from licensed firearm dealer. 2017 Sutherland Springs church shooting, guns were legally purchased from gun stores, although his domestic violence conviction could have prohibited the purchase. Why didn't it? I don't know. 2018 Parkland school shooting, firearms legally purchased at a gun store. The takeaway point, in 80% of the deadliest mass shootings, these firearms were acquired legally. So what can we do? What should be done? The lesson is that people who have admitted homicidal or suicidal thoughts or interest in committing mass shootings should be prohibited from purchasing or possessing firearms. I will go a step further and say they should be limited from having access to. If you as a family member know that your adolescent has expressed an interest in killing themselves or shooting others, then A, why do you have a firearm at home? And if you really want a firearm at home, then B, it needs to be the most secure safe that you can have. Make sure they do not have access to it. Currently, federal law prohibits people from possessing firearms if they have been involuntarily committed, adjudicated to be mentally defective, or met several other disqualifying criteria. But most of the public mass shooters examined here were able to obtain their weapons legally despite engaging in leakage and having their concerning behavior or interest in homicide reported to law enforcement. And I'm going to talk about leakage in a minute here. Basically, if people express implicitly that they're having thoughts of harming others or themselves, why are we giving these people firearms? They should not be allowed to have firearms. The best legal mechanism for keeping firearms out of their hands might be risk protection orders, and these are also known as gun violence restraining orders or gun violence protective orders, which have been recently adopted in several states. These orders basically allow families, household members, or law enforcement officers to petition a court directly for an order temporarily restricting a person's access to guns. This study's findings provide further clarity on which warning signs should be considered when making the determination of risk. More specifically, if people who engage in the most extreme form of leakage, admitting their homicidal thoughts or interest in committing mass killings, were prevented from acquiring firearms, many of the deadliest incidents of the past 20 years may have been avoided. It seems hard to imagine that most Americans would argue that people have a right to possess firearms after they have had such overtly concerning statements about harming themselves or others. It's just common sense that if someone says they want to kill a whole bunch of people, we shouldn't be putting firearms in their arms, especially high-capacity firearms. From the perspective of both members of the public who are considering reporting leakage and law enforcement officers, keeping at-risk individuals from obtaining weapons may stop them from doing something terrible without requiring them to be imprisoned or institutionalized. So it's the better alternative. False positives, that means taking guns away from people that were not going to commit mass shootings, may still happen, but false positives will continue to be a challenge. But at least people who are inaccurately perceived to be threats by those erring on the side of caution would only lose their firearms and not their freedom. Because when these people go through with their plan, they're inevitably going to be A, killed, or B, incarcerated. Next, we move on to another lesson that can be gleaned. We do know that perpetrators of mass shootings engage in what we call leakage. Leakage of mass shooters' violent thoughts and intent. Prevention appears possible in a vast majority of cases. Based on the findings of this study, the vast majority of the deadliest public mass shootings in the United States over the past 2 decades appear to have been preventable based on the information known about offenders in advance. This assertion is consistent with the FBI's conclusions in their aforementioned report. What this study found was that the perpetrators of the deadliest mass shootings all engaged in what they call leakage. And leakage is basically the mass shooters are self-identifying themselves. They oftentimes will make either subtle threats, boasts, innuendos, predictions, or ultimatums. So for example, subtle threats like, oh, they'll be sorry they bullied me, or boasts, pretty soon everyone will know my name, or predictions or ultimatums. Predictions, they're going to be sorry they said that. So essentially, there is cause for hope because there is something that can be done. There are observable behaviors that represent critical opportunities for detection and disruption. There is more hope because in the deadliest of cases, those were the cases where the most leakage was occurring. One potential explanation for this difference is the fact that maybe with the deadliest mass shootings, there's more planning periods. And a lot of times they will be planning this for more than 6 months. Nearly all of the deadliest public mass shooters in this study planned for 6 months or longer. In turn, longer planning may be associated with more leakage from potential perpetrators, along with more opportunities to prevent their attacks. So what you can do as the general public, needs to be more educated, to be tuned in to when people are making these threats on social media or threats to them, or if someone is glorifying or showing you videos of mass shootings, report those individuals. Why are people not reporting them? Well, they're seeing that the public, the general public, is more hesitant to report close friends versus acquaintances. Why? Because with close friends, we have a blindfold on. It's time to take that blindfold off. You have a responsibility. If your loved one is showing these concerning signs, you have to report it. People aren't reporting it because they see it as a sign of betrayal, or there's a diffused perspective where they think like, oh, well, I'm not going to report it, but this is so troubling that I'm pretty sure someone else has reported it. It's a phenomenon where someone sees someone being hurt or someone on the floor and no one calls 911 because everyone else assumes that someone else called 911. So you need to take responsibility. If you see something that is troubling, it is better to report it. This leads us to intervention number 2, public reporting of potential mass shooters to law enforcement. The public should be educated, encouraged, and pressured to report leakage and warning signs to law enforcement. The public needs to be reminded that they are the first line of defense against mass shootings, and they should be more effectively educated, encouraged, and pressured to serve as the eyes and ears of law enforcement. Not only do regular citizens outnumber police officers in the United States by a ratio of more than 300 to 1, which means they are often present in situations where law enforcement is not, but they also hear leakage threats and attack intentions that offenders might not express in front of a police officer. For example, the UCC shooter's mother did not report her son because she worried that an arrest would make his life more difficult. Similarly, the Red Lake shooter and Charleston church shooter were not reported by their friends despite making explicit threats about mass shootings, and the Orlando shooter's wife did not report him even though he apparently discussed attacking a nightclub. Public information campaigns should emphasize that failure to report a potential mass shooter is not only a violation of one's public and social responsibility, but it can also have serious personal consequences. Far too many families, friends, and coworkers have had to live with traumatic guilt after they saw something but said nothing. Retrospective testimonials could be widely disseminated, featuring people who now regret having not reported their friends or family when it could have been prevented. This could help increase public awareness and could promote social change. Similarly, every effort should be made to foster the kind of positive climates and police-community relationships which encourage reporting behavior. The next lesson that can be gleaned is law enforcement needs to be educated and trained on how to more effectively investigate potential threats. A lot of times the public does report these threats, but there are times where law enforcement fail to effectively investigate potential threats. For example, although a psychiatrist in the 2012 Aurora movie theater shooting contacted both the university's police department and its behavioral evaluation and threat assessment team, there was no action that was done. If police had looked closer into this case, they might have discovered that he exhibited many of the key warning signs outlined in this study, and that would have revealed he was acquiring weapons, building homemade explosives, and running surveillance on potential targets. Law enforcement officers should be better educated and trained on identifying the common warning signs in offenders' lives and evaluating potential threats, because not all threats are equally dangerous. Research shows that when potential threats are reported to law enforcement, law enforcement often responds by checking that suspect's criminal record and possible affiliations with other criminals. However, many public mass shooters do not have connections to other criminals and have not been convicted of violent crimes prior to their attacks. And when interviewed, many of these individuals can successfully fool law enforcement investigators into believing that they are not dangerous. Of course, law enforcement officers have a wealth of professional knowledge and field experience, and they are accustomed to being lied to. However, most public mass shooters are psychologically and behaviorally different from the criminals whom police deal with on a regular basis, and therefore, police should be better educated to identify them. This suggests that law enforcement may be susceptible to some of the popular misconceptions about those likely to engage in mass murder. For instance, if they assume that someone intelligent, well-educated, polite, articulate, or middle class could not pose a threat due to these particular traits, they would overlook many of the types of people who have committed public mass shootings in the past. So law enforcement needs to look out for suicidal motives or life indifference that might eliminate fear of consequences, perceptions of his or her own victimization that might rationalize attacks against targets. For example, if this person is racist and thinks that immigrants are taking their job or are taking over them, that person feels victimized and wants to take out the anger against the target. And C, desire to obtain fame or attention through killing. In conclusion, we need to do better. There is research that is being done, and we need to approach this issue logically and objectively. And we need to tackle this issue so that people do not continue to die in mass shootings. Thank you so much for watching, and one way that we can make change is by us being observant, but also holding our lawmakers accountable. Enough is enough. Change needs to happen. Laws need to be implemented. The research and the data prove this.